Okay, welcome back. Now that we've gone over an overview of this tutorial, some of the things we're going to cover, how to load up Mental Ray and so on and so forth, it's actually time to get in here and start playing around with Mental Ray a bit. So the first thing I want to talk about is how to test render. Test rendering is an important process of the workflow to finding that perfect render for your scene or your project. So let's go ahead and open up an example scene so you can see what I'm talking about. Hit Control O to open up the scene browser here. And the scene you want to go ahead and look for is called 01 Scene Primitives Start. So we'll hit Don't Save. I don't want to save that scene that was there. Okay, so I have a pretty simple scene. If I go to Shaded View, it's very, very simple scene. Just some primitives here, as the name of the scene suggests. Don't worry, we'll be working on much cooler and better looking scenes than this later. But for now, I just want to go over some bare basics of rendering and the Mental Ray renderer inside of Maya 2009. Okay, so how do we render this out? Well, it's pretty simple. This rendering shelf has got a few icons here. It's got this icon, then it's got this one that says IPR, and then it's got this one over here, and another one over here for little blue sphere. Okay, and if you hover over these icons, you get little tooltips that tell you what the icons are. We have the render current frame, IPR, render settings window, and render diagnostics. We're going to be using all four of those throughout the duration of this tutorial. Okay, so test rendering. You have to know how to render and how to test render before you can even learn how to use Mental Ray. So let's go ahead and tackle that subject first. How to test render. Well, there's a couple of ways we can test render. Let's start off by doing just a regular render. We can render the current frame by hitting this icon that's right here called render current frame. We can also render current frame by coming up here to the main render menu and going to render current frame right here. Once we do that, the render view window opens. That's this window right here, and our render will be performed of our scene. We'll also get some information down here. The information includes the size of the image, in this case a 640 by 480 pixel image, as well as the zoom of the image. It'll also tell us in parentheses right here which renderer we use to perform the render. In this case, the default renderer, which is Maya software, not Mental Ray. It'll also tell you the frame number at which we render this, which is the first frame of an animation. There exists no animation here, but by default it's frame 1. And it'll also tell you the render time, which is extremely important for tweaking and working with Mental Ray. Okay, and it took 1 second to render this out. And it'll also tell you the camera that we rendered this out from. In this case, the default perspective camera, which is shown here with the word persp for short. Okay, and then we have all these icons up here, and then sort of main menu up here with lots of different menu items and things like that. First thing we need to do is switch to Mental Ray. Since this is a new scene we opened up and the renderer wasn't defined, it's going to default over to the My Software renderer. By clicking on this drop down box here, we can go ahead and select the Mental Ray renderer. Okay, so what we currently did was we rendered out the current single frame using this render view window. Okay, but there's a few other ways that we can render out. Say for example you only wanted to render out a small piece of this image here. Why would you want to do that? Well, this render only took 1 second, but let's say for example we're doing a high-end scene that takes a whole minute to render out. If you need to just see a change, like let's say the color of this cylinder right here, you don't want to render out the entire image. You might just want to render out this area around the cylinder so you could see what the change looks like when you change, say, the color of the material on that cylinder. So what you can do is just left click and drag with your mouse to create this Marquee Selection, which is also known as a render region, which is shown in this red box or this red rectangle. Then what you can do is come over here to this icon right here that has a similar red rectangle called the render region button. Hit that button and Mental Ray will go ahead and render out just this section right here, as opposed to rendering out the whole image, which can take longer to do. Okay, the button immediately to the left simply renders the entire frame. So if I hit that, the whole frame gets rendered out, not just the region. That's the same thing as coming up here to the main render menu and hitting the render current frame button. Or it's also the same thing as hitting this render current frame button right here in my shelf. So there's literally about 4 ways that you can render out. You can hit this button here on the shelf. You can hit this render current frame button up here in the main menu. You can hit this icon right here for rendering inside the render view window. Or you can even go over here to the editor, render that out of the video. Edit that out of the video, starting again in 3, 2, 1. Or you can come over here to render and hit redo previous render. And it's the same thing as hitting the render current frame button. So you can see there's up to 4 ways right there where you can do the same exact thing. That's one thing you want to keep in mind about working with Maya. There's always about 1,001 ways to do the same thing. Okay, so now that you saw how to render out a still and how to render out a region or render region, we can also render out just a selected object. So if I move this window a little bit out of the way here, and I select, say, this cone that's right there, right? So now it's selected. Let me go over here to the render menu over here inside of the render view window, and you notice that we have this option here that says render selected objects only. If I go ahead and select that option, and I have something actually selected like this cone over here, if I do a render, you'll notice that nothing gets rendered out except for that cone. So basically just select an object and render again, and it renders only that object out. This can be pretty useful for isolating a specific object for whatever reason that you may find yourself needing it, and it's just a good option to have. Okay? Alright, so let me go ahead and let me remove that option simply by selecting it again. Now if I render again, it's going to render out my entire scene here. So that's one other way of rendering. Now let's look at something else interesting about Maya, specifically Maya 2009, and that's called the IPR. If you remember, we looked at this icon up here that looks just like the render current frame button, but it says IPR inside this little icon. So what is IPR? IPR stands for Interactive Photorealistic Renderer, and the IPR is a very interesting tool. Let me show you how it works instead of just explaining it to you. There's a couple of ways we can do an IPR. We can click on the IPR icon here in the shelf, or we can click on the IPR icon here in the render view. Doesn't matter which one you choose. Either way, the button does the same exact thing. So let's go ahead and click on that IPR, and you'll notice that this happens. We get ourselves a wireframe view of our scene. And down here you'll see in these in yellow text, it'll say select a region to begin tuning. What does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and draw a region here, and it renders pretty much instantly. Okay, so what is IPR? But pretty much looks the same as rendering a current frame. All it's doing is just rendering out this area while the background remains as a wireframe. Well, not quite. If we go ahead and we take one of these objects and we move them, you'll notice that the IPR starts to update continually every time I make a change. Now the IPR is limited to what it can update. There's some things that it can't update with Mental Ray. Now in the past, in previous versions of Maya, the IPR was only useful when using the Maya software renderer. It really wasn't very useful for using Mental Ray because the IPR mainly supported features from the Maya software renderer and pretty much neglected Mental Ray almost entirely. Okay, well that's changed in Maya 2009. The IPR now supports tons and tons of features in Mental Ray. In fact, the IPR is so good that I strongly recommend that you use it when rendering out Mental Ray because it's going to help you fine-tune and tune the quality as well as the look of your scenes when you're rendering out Mental Ray in Maya 2009. So I strongly recommend that you use it, and we will be using it very heavily for this tutorial. In fact, we'll probably be using it about 90% of the time while working throughout this entire tutorial and all the projects that come with this training product. So that just shows you how powerful this feature is and how useful it has become in Maya 2009. So it's actually come a long way. Okay, so it's pretty simple how it works. And then you can just draw a new region over another area. And, well, in this case I have the cone selected. So you can draw regions over any area that you want. Only that area will be rendered out. And the IPR uses a technology that allows these renders to pop up very, very quick, much faster than hitting the regular render button. See, the regular render button just goes ahead and does a final render. IPR uses some neat tricks that the engineers over at Autodesk have come up with to render things out a lot faster. In some cases, practically instantly. In other cases, it won't be instant, but it's still pretty fast. So it's a very useful tool to use. Now, like I mentioned before, the IPR supports some things in Mental Ray, while others it doesn't. With Maya 2009, the IPR supports things like moving objects around, changing the settings of a light, things like that. It can also support changing of shadows, as well as global illumination and final gather, which is very important. And we're going to be using that in this tutorial, so that's where the IPR can come in pretty useful. But there's still a few limitations to the IPR. For example, we can't use the IPR for irradiance particles, and we can't use the IPR for importons. And there's a few other little things here and there we can't use the IPR for, which is unfortunate. But at least it's better than nothing, and we can use the IPR for about 80%, if not 90% of our work, which still makes it very, very useful. Okay? To refresh the IPR, just hit the IPR button again. Okay? After you've made a region here for the IPR to go ahead and render out, you can hit this green button here, which can refresh your IPR. And you'll notice that it refreshes the entire thing here. So the IPR button creates a brand new IPR render for you to go ahead and start doing some of these preview renders with. And the green button refreshes the current IPR, which is very important. There'll be some times where we'll make certain changes, and you'll get to see that throughout this tutorial. And the only way to refresh the changes is to use the re-render IPR button as opposed to the refresh button. And you'll get to see that for the duration of this tutorial, so you'll understand when and where to use this button here on the left or this green button over here on the right. Okay, so that's the IPR. Okay, let me go over here and do a regular rendered still of our scene. There's more stuff here to keep in mind about how this render view window works. Editor, edit that out of video, starting again, 3, 2, 1. There's more things to keep in mind about how this editor window right here, the render view, how it works, okay? And one other thing that we can do is we can save images for comparison. So let's say, for example, I have my scene set up like this. I can go ahead and use these two buttons up here. The left one is called the Keep Image, and the right one is called Remove Image. If I keep the image, you'll notice that now there's this slider down here on the bottom of the render view window. Right now it's not doing anything when I slide it back and forth because I only have one image recorded here, which is the current one that I rendered. Okay. Now let's say that I go ahead and with the cone selected, I move it and maybe I rotate it. Now I do a new render, and that's the change right there. Now what I can do is go back with this the scroll icon, and I can go back to the previous frame and now to the current frame, so I can look at the before and after, before and after. Kind of similar to when you go to the optometrist to get your eyes checked out, and he's always telling you before, after, before, after. I don't know, just my crazy experiences. So it's a very neat little tool. You can save out these different images, and you can save out a whole bunch. As you can see, you can keep hitting this button and save out a lot of these renders out, and you can just scroll between them one after the other. So it's a very awesome way of working there, and we're going to be using it quite a bit for the duration of this tutorial. So right now it may not seem like a very useful tool or whatnot, it may not seem that interesting, but as we work in our projects for this tutorial, you'll get to see how to use this effectively and how useful it is and how important it is to the render process. Keep in mind that we can also comment images. So what does that mean, comment images? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's say we want to save out this image right here with the cone on top of the cylinder right there. If you come over here to the Keep Image button, and instead of left clicking on it, go ahead and right click and hold down the right mouse button, you get this sort of a secret menu over here, and you can select another option here called Keep Image with Comment. And when you do that, a custom comment box opens up, and you can enter in a custom comment. So let's call this Happy Cone. Okay, now this render here will have a comment on the bottom that says Happy Cone. So, well, you're not going to be doing renders and typing in Happy Cone. So how can that be useful? Well, it can be very useful, because what we can do, say if we're in a more serious situation, and you can type in a different comment. For example, this render shows the green shader Joe made. Okay, So let's say you're working with a team or something and somebody sends you this file, they want you to compare this. They can put in a comment something like this, for example. This render shows the green shader Joe made. So Joe's some imaginary guy that works at the studio, and he made a green shader, and you're coming over here and you're comparing and contrasting the green shader Joe made compared to the shader that you made, and maybe you end up deleting Joe's shader and saying it accidentally disappeared. So there you go. So let's go ahead and let's move this to the right and remove the image, and now it's gone. And we can also go here, right click on the remove image button, and we can remove the current image, or we can remove all of them. So if we have a whole bunch of them in here and we don't want to go ahead and get rid of them one by one, we can just right click here, hit remove all images, and there you go. Now they're all gone. If we render again, we have a brand new render, and the comment is gone because this is a new render. Okay, so there's a few more things I want to talk about here. There's all these icons up here, and we haven't seen what every single icon does. So I'm pretty much going to show you that now. Another one of these icons is this snapshot icon here, which if you hover, it'll tell you it's the snapshot icon. This is basically just an icon of a camera here, and if we click on it, we'll get ourselves a little wireframe view of our scene here. Very similar to when we hit the IPR button. So what's useful about this? Well, there's certain situations where you might actually find this useful. Say you want to clear this render out, or you move the camera and you need to see the position of the camera through the render view window. You can hit that button and you'll be able to see a wireframe camera view of your scene through the render view window, which can help you to position a camera when you're going to do a new render or an IPR or something like that. Okay. Then over here we have this button right here, which if we hover over it, the tooltip tells us it's the render settings window. So let's click on that. That opens up a new window here, and this window is called the render settings window. And right now we can do a few things here. For example, we have the render layer up here, which we're not going to get into. It's just another part of Maya and doesn't really have much to do with Mental Ray exclusively. And over here we have the render using drop down box, which lets us select the different renderers available to us right now in Maya. It's the same thing as coming here to the render view window and going into this drop down box and selecting Mental Ray or the Maya software renderer, etc., etc. And then we have different tabs here. We have a common tab, passes tab, so on and so forth. Don't worry about it. In the next video, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about this render settings window. Let's close it for now. Okay. There's a few other buttons here and icons that I want to go over in the render view window as well. One key thing to note about this render view window is that just like you can use the mouse scrolling wheel inside of the viewport here to zoom in and out, we can also use the mouse scrolling wheel to zoom in and out of this image. So if you need to zoom in, get a closer look at one of these areas of your image here, you can do that. You can also pan by holding down the Alt key and using the same middle mouse button to go ahead and click and drag and pan around your render here. Okay. So let's say you zoomed out or you zoomed in really close and you want it to go back to the regular zoom. You can click on this one-to-one icon here, which will go ahead and reset the zoom back to the default size, to basically the 100% size or regular standard zoom. Okay, so it's a pretty useful way of working there with the render view. And then we have this other icon over here, the one with this blue little spear. This is the render diagnostics button. If we go ahead and click that, you get the script editor pops up. And just please try to ignore all of this stuff up here. In fact, what I'm going to do is hold down the right mouse button, and I'll just click on clear history here to go ahead and clear that history out. And let me go back here to the render view, and I'm going to click again on render diagnostics, and there we go. What you'll see is this line here that says Mental Ray render diagnostics, and below it'll say 0 warning in this case. If there was something wrong with the scene, or if Maya had some kind of suggestion for you or a tip as to something that can help you render out faster or optimize your renderer, or in case there's something wrong that's not going to render correctly, Maya would tell you with these render diagnostics. So the render diagnostics are pretty useful to use every now and then, just to troubleshoot your render here and see if everything's okay, or if there's something wrong, what we can do to fix it. Alright, don't worry, we're almost done here. There's these two icons here. This one shows red, green, and blue. This one basically just displays the color channel. So if I go over here and do a render, and I click on this, I can see the RGB, which is what we're seeing right now. And if I click this editor, edit that out of the video, edit that out of the video, starting again in 3, 2, 1. Sorry about that. Editor, edit that out of the video, starting again in 3, 2, 1. So we have over here this display RGB channels icon, which we already have the RGB channels displayed here in the render view. If we click on this white sphere icon here, it shows us the alpha channel of the image. So you can see the alpha channel for compositing and post-production software in case you need to go ahead and render out and do that somewhere else. Okay, so let's switch back to RGB. If we right-click on the RGB, we can isolate certain channels. For example, the red, the green, the blue, or the luminance. Okay, so that's pretty useful there to see the different color channels in the render view. And then another useful tool is if we go to Options, we can go to Test Resolution, and we get this sub-menu. And right here, we can choose different test resolutions to render this out with. Right now, the default is set to the render settings, which is set to 640 by 480 pixels. I can select 10% of that, 25% of that, half of that with 50%, so it'll be 320 by 240, 75% of that, or as you can see, I can keep going here up to 150% of my original render, which would actually make the render bigger. So if my renders are going a little bit slow and I'm just doing testing and previewing and things like that, I might want to knock down the size to 75% or 50%, and if I do that and do another render, now you see the render is half the size of what it was before. It went from 640 to 320. Okay, so let me go back to Options, Test Resolution, set it back to Render Settings, which is the default. Render that out again. Okay. Alright, so I know this video wasn't very interesting. I promise the tutorial is going to get a lot more interesting very soon. But we really need to go over these basics, because if you don't know these things and you're not familiar with these things are going to go very, very difficult and very slow later once we get into the fun stuff with Mental Ray. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. That's going to do it for this video here. In the next video, I'll go ahead and pick up where I left off, and we're going to talk about the render settings window. So don't worry, just hang in there. We're getting through this, and things will get pretty interesting very soon, I promise.